Good morning, everybody. Posting this video for you about the media. We're starting our next unit, and there's just tons of great stuff that we're going to be able to talk about. And there's a really cool overlap on everything when we're talking about the media. We're talking about political parties, talking about campaign and elections and interest groups. And even though we've kind of broken this down a week at a time, there's going to be, like I said, lots of overlap, and we'll be able to entwine this. And so, because this is a short week, and next week's a short week, but because this week's a short week, and because you're going to be doing an activity in class that I'm calling the Media Jigsaw, I wanted to be able to post your notes or your lecture online so that you can watch this and watch it over and over and over again, because I'm sure that you will. But at least you have this accessible to you in case there's something that you're not quite getting in class. So I just want to try to give you an introduction about maybe some of the background of media, how it got to where it is today, and then just maybe some core information that you can supplement along with your JANDA readings. So when I'm talking about media, I'm talking about cyber politics. You did a reading over the weekend called Bad News, and that sort of traced or just demonstrated the shift from traditional news media into the blogosphere today. And so we'll examine some of this and talk about how that's sort of changing the flavor, the environment of the information that you read, and how much quicker things are accessible to us now that we can get our news through different filters, different people's perspectives that you may call amateurs. So that does give us a different angle on the news. So historically, well, as you could have seen in your bad news reading, most of our history we've had printed media, and that's played a huge role in defining the public debate when it comes to politics. And so today, more than 90% of Americans use television. And we had a time period throughout the 50s, late 50s, all the way up until just recently, that people used television as their primary news source. And so the internet today is becoming the emerging biggest news resource. So the functions of the media, of what it is that our media provides for us. So obviously, we'll have entertainment, and even with entertainment, things that we might watch for pleasure, there is a possibility of having lots of different controversial topics laced into those television shows, and that could stimulate public opinion. You also have reporting the news, and this is the primary function of the mass media in all forms, whether that's newspaper, magazines, radio, television, cable, online news, etc. It's reporting the news. So in addition to that, we have identifying public problems, and the power of information is important, not just to reveal what's going on, what the government's doing, but also in determining what the government should do. In other words, to set the public agenda. You also have the media socializing a new generation of people. And so the media, particularly television, has a huge influence on the beliefs and the opinions of all Americans. Just going back to the last unit, you think about what those American beliefs or ideals are, those are often framed by the media. So in addition to that, you have providing a political forum. The media provides a political forum, and what I mean by that is it gives a place, or it gives candidates an opportunity to use these different avenues, newspapers, television, etc., to establish or make sure people understand what their interests are, what their motivations are. And also the media makes profit, and so this is through charging for advertising. This could be through sponsorships. You have pledges through agencies or media forums like PBS, GPTV, or NPR. So anyway, that's kind of just a general overview of the different functions of media. But as far as looking at the media historically in the United States, this is something that's really only been a phenomenon for the last couple of hundred years. And of course, the United States has only been around for a couple of hundred years, but the politics in the United States to start with were controlled by a very small elite group. So when we go back to thinking of the elite theory, that's really what happened in the United States. During the 1800s and just before the 1800s, news traveled extremely slow. And a lot of times the official version of the news was framed by this power elite. There were roughly about 3,000 newspapers by the mid-1800s. And some of these were mainly just sensation mongers. That means these were newspaper agencies that would just stir up the hottest issues, the most controversial issues, things that you might think about making the front pages of tabloids. That was sort of the the main operation of the time period was just try to make sales. It didn't necessarily matter if the news was accurate or true. It was all about making that buck. So many historians would believe today that the growth of printed media uh, played a role in unifying the country. As media became more serious and people started to invest more, spend more time finding out what was going on in their country, there was this idea of being an American that united the different states into one nation. In the early years of the United States, um, there was a big number of politically sponsored newspapers. And so the sole existence of each of these newspapers or each of these periodicals was to further the interest of specific politicians or specific political parties that paid for their publication. And even George Washington was a fan of this. This was called managed news. And so what George Washington believed is that the public did have a right to know what was going on, but they didn't have to know everything that was going on. And there was a category of issues that should be kept secret, and that if the public knew everything, it might possibly damage the image of the United States. And so certain things shouldn't be published. Then you have this emergence of mass readership newspapers. And two things that happened that allow this to become where you have more people read newspapers was that in the 19th century, you have high-speed rotary press. So this means that you have faster presses. This means lower cost per unit or per newspaper. And that means that subscription prices come lower too. So since it's cheaper to access and cheaper to make, more people start to buy subscriptions to newspapers, or just individual newspapers at least. Second thing that happens in 1848 is that you have the telegraph. And the Associated Press, the AP, developed the telegraph into a nationwide apparatus for the distribution of all types of information systematically. They perfected this. So along with these changes comes a growing population. All these different immigrant groups are coming into the United States. Cities are growing, so you have increasing urbanization. And so daily newspapers could actually be supported by large and more urban populations. You even have some cities that are publishing a morning edition of the nursepaper and the evening edition of the newspaper. So you actually have some pretty literate communities throughout the United States. The burgeoning diversification, or these different groups popping up in the United States, are encouraging lots of different growth in advertising to hit these different groups. Growing wealth also encourages different types of advertising, and this means that newspapers can actually access these different revenues or these different monies that are coming in. And then what you start to have is this age of the popular press because of this, because it's so popular to read the newspapers. The popular press kind of takes its position, and you have this time period that's kind of known as yellow journalism. This is in the last half of the 1800s. Even if the newspaper journalists or the owners didn't have a particular political party that they were trying to match up with, or an axe to grind, if you want to call it that, they often did allow the editors to engage in sensationalism and something that was over the top. It kind of goes back to those to the days of the early 1800s, where it was just whatever could sell. This is known as yellow journalism. Sometimes, and you can maybe define that as questionable or just simply personal activities of prominent businessmen, politicians, or socialites being published in these newspapers, even on the front page, just to sell the copies. This is another way, unfortunately, that newspapers maximize their readership. And even today, if you look at some newspapers, or even go online and look at some of the online news sites, you see that their headings a lot of times kind of cater to that sensationalism, and it's still rewarded by really high levels of readership. Then comes the age of the electromagnetic signal, and this happens in the 1920s. Actually, I think the first broadcast was in November of 1920, and these were when the news stories were transmitted over the airwaves. And so you have the presidential race at the time was between Warren G. Harding and a guy named James M. Cox. Excuse me. Then by 1924, you have over 1,400 radio stations in the United States. So this is something that develops very quickly, just in a period of 4 years. Um, Politicians realize that they can take advantage of this. And so campaign jingles start to pop up on radios. You have debates that are popping up on radio. But in the 1952 presidential campaign, that was the first campaign that both candidates really utilized the power of the radio. So it took a couple of decades for politicians to really take hold of this in a way that they realized it was going to be worth their while. In that same year of 1952, that's when you have the emergence of the television as well. So you have people finally figuring out that radio is going to be a great way to campaign, and then as soon as people have started to figure that out, you have this new medium pop in with the television. The role of television kind of revolutionized the electronic media. It revolutionized campaigning and politics. It revolutionized how people view the truth. And it revolutionized how people manage their day and what happened in their household. I mean, this is something that changes the atmosphere of your living room, honestly, once you have a television set. And so what develops because of the television is this thing called narrowcasting, where consumers will watch only the shows and the channels that they like, and they go to that news channel. You see this a lot more solidified today with news, because you have people that will go to a certain news channel because that's the news that they want to listen to. But it starts to emerge during this time period. During the years of the 50s and 60s, you have people watching the three major networks. That begins to decline in the 1980s, and by 2001, network television shares of the audience had fallen all the way from the lower 70s down to about 55%. And at the same time, you see a growth in the percentage of houses that have internet access. And so you see that there's this shift for the first time where people choose to go to the internet for their news instead of to televisions. You also have this creation of talk show politics. And multiple news outlets have utilized talk shows where you might have talk shows on television, you might have it on radio, you might even have it on internet, and the most of the talk has been on radio. You turn on radio stations and you can hear this a lot of times during the afternoons. But there's been a considerable criticism of political talk shows. Critics say that the shows increase the level of intolerance and irrationality in the United States. And listeners of those shows are a lot of times self-selected. They tend to share the same viewpoint of the host. We talked about this in class about getting affirmation or going to take polls from viewers to show the opinions on a certain topic. We are only getting the opinions of the people who listen to your show who agree with a certain political standpoint anyway. So is that poll really accurate? So you have this cycle that we discussed in the previous unit. Anyway, so television today still is, for today, the most influential medium. It's also big business. National news personalities, they earn millions of dollars per year from their television reporting contracts. They're paid just tons of money because they have large audiences, and because a large audience commands high prices in advertising and national news shows, and so this is a big business generator. In the last few years, last decade or so, most news networks have also added an internet site that they try to capture the market. And so a lot of times you'll see news hitting first on the internet, and then the story will develop on television. You're also seeing this emergence of not just the internet, but of Web 2.0 websites or social media like Twitter and different instant media sites where people can contribute pictures or videos can be uploaded, and then the news agencies can catch a hold of that. And so you have news being released there before it's ever released on the television or on the radio. So as far as campaigns go, as far as the connection between media and political campaigns, all forms of media, whether it be television or newspaper, radio, magazines, online services, they have an enormous political impact on American society. And the media influence is most obvious during political campaigns. You can definitely see the influence. And if the media was not there, just imagine how hard it would be to really find out the different stances of the political candidates. And because of this, we'll talk about the connection with the Electoral College in a couple of weeks. But because television is the primary news source for most Americans, candidates and their consultants, the people who kind of shape their image, spend a lot of their time devising strategies to use television to their benefit. So just think back on those commercials that you discovered for the different types of propaganda techniques. Those are pitched more and more online now, but a lot of times they're being pitched on television, they've been pitched on the radio, even been put in newspapers to cater or try to appeal to a certain perspective. All right. You have a lot of debates that you might come across on television. You will also hear them online. You can hear sound bites of these on the radio. You might even find blurbs of these debates in the newspaper. And a lot of times, I want you to think about these as being equally as important to advertising, because these are performance of the candidates. And incumbent presidents are debating with challengers. They a lot of times are put on equal footing, and some of the earlier candidates felt like this was something they didn't want to engage in. They felt like it was beneath them to be on the stage, if you want to call it a stage, with somebody else who was running for their position. So this is something that's become more popular since the mid 1800s, but I just think that's interesting that at first a lot of the incumbents that were already in office, really did not want to participate in any type of a debate. I also want you to consider, as you're looking at different resources, especially for your hot topics, the media's impact on voters. Voters watch campaign commercials and news political campaigns with selective attentiveness. Okay, and what that means is they tend to watch the commercials that support their candidates that they favor, and they tend to pay attention to news stories about their own candidates. This is, just natural. Apparently, the media are the most influential with those persons or those people who have not only formed an opinion about their candidates, but also about the different issues. And so studies have shown that all the activity that you see on television, as far as commercials and debates, immediately before the election day has the most impact on those voters who are completely undecided. So it's that day before. So you turn on the television the day before the election, you're going to be flooded with these different campaign ads and these smear campaigns and a lot of these different types of commercials. As far as the presidency goes, in particular, there's a bit of a love-hate relationship between the media and the president, and the relationship is most often reciprocal. And the media needs the president to survive to sell the newspapers. The president needs the media to survive to get his agenda across, to make sure that people understand what he's doing, and to have transparency on the things that he wants to be transparent on. Because of this codependency, both the media and the president have to work hard to exploit the other. And so they always want to be able to, that's why the president holds media conferences with the different news agencies, so that they can have this open air. The media needs to report and the president needs the coverage. So they kind of coexist because of each other. It also helps the president to set the public agenda. The media is the one that allows this to happen. And the evidence is very strong that whatever public problems there are, they receive the most media treatment, and it works to the president's advantage to be accessible, so that he can frame that in a way that he feels the American people need to find out about that. Because of this openness, or because of this desire for the media to make a buck, to make money by selling newspapers, having radio coverage, internet coverage, television time, etc., there is a desire from the government to regulate the media. You have controlled ownership of the media. The First Amendment does not mention electronic media because it didn't exist when the Bill of Rights were written. And for many reasons, the government has greater control over the electronic media than it does on printed media. There's kind of been this loophole. Through the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, the government is able to regulate communications by radio, by television, by wire, and by cable. And the number of radio stations has been controlled for many years because of this FCC loophole. The FCC has also created a situation in which the major television networks have dominated the airwaves. FCC rules have dealt with ownership of news media, such as, like I said, how many stations can work on the network and so on. And then you have the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And what this act does is it ends the rule that kept a number of telephone companies from entering the cable business and other communication markets. And so what this means is that a single corporation, whether you have AT&T or Disney or somebody else, they can offer a long-distance telephone service. They can offer television, cable news. They can offer satellite television. They can offer internet services. And, of course, you have libraries of films and entertainment. So you can have these massive blocks of news agencies controlling a lot of different avenues that people might receive their news from. You also have a desire for the government to control content, not just the different resources or the different avenues that it comes out of, but the actual content that's being transmitted. And in general, broadcasting industry has avoided the government regulating the content by establishing their own codes. And so this code consists of a set of rules that was developed by the National Association of Broadcasters, the lobby for this would be the lobbyist for TV and for radio news. And these codes regulate the amount of sex or the amount of violence, nudity, profanity, and so forth that's allowed to air. And so by abiding by this code that's completely voluntary on the part of networks and stations, the government has kind of played nice and stepped back and said, okay, you guys can regulate yourselves. Since 1980, there's been a continued public debate over whether the government should attempt to control polling or should attempt to control early calling of presidential elections by television networks. And we talked in class about the negative side of this. If the East Coast is already calling an election and they're 3 hours ahead of the West Coast, this might in some way influence voter turnout and might influence voter decisions. And so some people say that's not really the role of media to get involved and to report that because of the butterfly effect, if you want to call it that. But you do have a public right to media access. Maybe I should ask that first. Maybe this is something we should talk about in class. Does the public have a right to access information? And we get into the issue now of Snowden releasing highly sensitive information from the United States government. You have the issue of WikiLeaks, of Julian Assange releasing video footage of some different things that I actually mentioned in class. Highly sensitive emails between world leaders being accessible now. Is this the role of the media? Does this violate any type of confidentiality that the government should have, or is this completely within the protections of the First Amendment? Both the FCC and the courts have gradually taken the stance that citizens do have a right to access media, particularly in electronic media. And the argument is that the airwaves are public because they're used for private profit, and the government has the right to dictate how they're used. So we kind of get into an issue right there. But technology does give people greater access to electronic media, and in particular to television. And as more cable operators have more airtime to sell, some of that time will remain unused and will be available for public access. And at the same time, the internet makes the media access by the public very, very easy, although not everybody has resources to take advantage of it, unfortunately. And the last thing I want to talk about is bias, and this is something that I want to have a lot of fun talking about in class, and I hope that you're able to pick this out. A classic study that was conducted in the 1980s found that media producers, editors, reporters, often what you might hear called the media elite, had a notably liberal, left-leaning bias in their news coverage. On the other hand, a lot of studies have concluded that there's a pro-conservative or pro-Republican bias in the overall stance of newspapers and the major networks. So you kind of have this possible split. Now with news agencies that cater to certain contingencies or certain demographics, a liberal audience, a conservative audience, you have a greater opportunity to catch the news that you want to catch. Something that I read last week that was really interesting was about Stephen Colbert, and obviously the Colbert Report is satire and not necessarily made up news, but a lot of jest and comedy is kind of intertwined, and a lot of tongue-in-cheek kind of kind of methods used to talk about the news. But what I was reading was saying that wherever you are politically, whether you're conservative or liberal, when you listen to Colbert, a lot of times if you're conservative, you see him as a conservative. If you're liberal, you see him as a liberal. So that's something that I think would be interesting to talk about in class. Maybe I can pull up some clips and we can talk about that. But there was a study that was done by a guy named Exo, E-X-O-O, Calvin Exo. And he had a study on politics and the media, and he suggested that journalists are not liberal necessarily nor conservative, but instead they're sort of hyper pro-American, and they have a pro-American bias of the media ownership and the journalists on their own code of whether or not they display or they write about or present their news objectively. Most journalists will be most interested in improving their own career prospects by covering the winning candidate, by pleasing their editors to get a better assignment for the next go around, and when they're discussing their political the person they're interviewing's public policies. So the bias in media is not towards criticizing the American system and producing news that will attract viewers without threatening the American way of life. So they're kind of recycling. They're not necessarily picking a side. If that didn't make any sense, we could talk more in class. Now, this is only supposed to be a primer. I've overloaded you with information. I've tried to talk really fast. This is just something I want you to refer back to just to kind of give you an introduction. The Janda readings, though, for this chapter, I hope that they're pretty clear. And with our jigsaw activity that we'll start doing this week, I think that you'll see how all this ties together. Another thing I want to do is give you some tweets from some different candidates in this most recent election and see if you can match up the tweet to the correct candidate. So that's a couple things that we'll talk about over the next few days. All right, well, this is me signing off, and I will see you guys in class.